talk about movement. So, in our previous games, since they've been two-dimensional, we've only had to deal with two axes. We've only had the x-axis and the y-axis. The only time we've dealt with the z-axis at all has been to increase or decrease the depth so that it shows in front of another object, but technically they are just layered on top of each other like pieces of paper, which is not going to be the case for our 3D project. We are going to have a player that moves around, and as the player moves, the camera is going to move with them. So we need to be able to have our movement. I was grabbing the camera itself. So we need to be able to move the player in this direction and side to side and be able to rotate it around, and eventually we'll add in some jumping mechanics. So we need to make a script. I've already made one that I haven't done anything with yet called player, and go ahead and open it up. So what you should look like just a nice blank empty script. The first thing that we need to do, just like we've done with all of our other different projects, is we are going to just assume that eventually we're going to want the player movement to be its own method. So we're going to go ahead and set that method up. So let's call this player movement parentheses semicolon, and it's giving me an error because there is no player movement. And I could fix this with quick fix by selecting it and then generate the method player movement, or I could go ahead and type it in. I'm just going to, for practice, go ahead and type it in. And remember, the reason I put it in update is I need it to check for player movement every single time that we are moving. So let's call it this, let's see, private void player movement. And remember, I'm having a terrible time typing. Remember, we want to keep it a private void because we don't need to call on the player movement from anything else. We don't need any other scripts controlling how the player moves. We only need this script attached to the player controlling how it moves. And so let's just take a peek at some of our old code here. So we've got on here, this is from the Asteroids game, so it's got some physics that are a little bit different, but it'll work for what we need. It's got a whole bunch of variables, so let's scroll on down here. In our void update, there's our player movement call. And here's how we did this. We got access to the axes, meaning we use the input of get axis vertical. So if we get our input, we're looking for up arrows and W arrows, and S for down, then or a down arrow, and then A and D for side to side. So that way we're getting all of the stuff that we want in one name. So we're going to use that same idea that we had right here with the get input vertical. We're going to use vertical for moving the character forward and backward. We're going to use horizontal instead of for moving side to side. We're going to use it for rotating. We're going to focus on forward to backward movement with the ability to rotate the camera being the way that we control how we see the scene. So we're not going to use relative force or anything this time. Let's just go ahead and keep it simple, because relative force works whenever you're dealing with a thruster or something that needs to move in a direction that is kind of delayed or feels like it has a burn behind it, but we're not doing that. We're a person, so we're going to move normal. Let's go ahead and set up some serialized fields also for our speed. So serialized field, we need to make it a float, and let's call it move speed. And we'll set this equal to, we'll call it 5F for right now. Because we might want to make it a percentage at some point. We're not sure yet. And then let's go ahead and do a serialized field. We know we're going to want to rotate as well, so we'll call it rotate speed, because we don't want the player like whipping around in circles. We'll set this to, I don't know, like 20. We want it to be responsive, but not feel like they're just like swinging their head around wildly trying to find what direction they're supposed to go. So let's start with that. Now, remember the player movement looking back at some of our other scripts, you would remember that the first thing we need to do to move something is to get its information about its transform, which, if we were looking at the player, is this little section right here. This tells it where it is in space and how we're going to move it around. So let's grab that script and type in, oh, am I typing? Okay, transform dot capital translate, and then we're going to, in parentheses, tell it how we want to translate. So we need a vector 3 translation. Before, we were using vector 2 translations. The only difference really is that vector 3 is going to give us 3 dimensions of options versus the regular 2. So we're going to go with 0x, 0y, and then we're going to input dot get axis, and then we want the axis to be vertical for this one. We're moving with this one, so we want it to be our up and down. Vertical. Oh, that needs to be in quotes. Let me go back to the beginning so it doesn't autocomplete. Vertical. So what we have here, 0, 0, input.getAxis vertical. So we're saying whenever the input getAxis vertical is equal to 1, which remember, getAxis is either 1 for on or 0 for off. And then we are going to multiply it by time dot delta time, remember, to give it a fixed amount of time. And then we're going to multiply that by move speed. And then we're going to end the statement. And make sure you save that so that everything is fixed in there. Right now we've got rotate speed still in here, but let's just double check and see how this affects our game. So those things that I told you about, the 0, 0 and input.getAxis, here is why. So our z, you can see from our player right here. Let me see if I can get a good view. Our z right here is forward and backward. So this is the one we want to change to 1 whenever we want to go hit the W or the S. We want W to go like this and S to go this way. So we need to change the z-axis number. Whenever we hit W, we don't also want it to go this direction or up. We don't want either of those things to happen. We only want it to go forward or backward. So that's why we changed that number. And we've got some numbers over here in this field. Let's see what happens. If I hit W, I go backward, and D, I go forward. So what's happened is it's taking it and doing it in reverse. So how can I change this? I'll give you a second to think about it and see if you figure it out. But basically, if we multiply it by a negative number, it will invert the equation. So we could also say negative input getAxis, or multiply by 1, negative 1. Let's see if this compiles. Now when I hit W, I go forward. And now I'm so far off the map. There we go. All right. Perfect. We have movement working in our game. The next thing we need to do is work on rotation. It is very much the same concept. So what I want you to do is pause this for just a second and see if you can figure out what you need to change. And I'll give you a hint. You're not dealing with the same direction. You're going left to right. So look at your player and figure out which one is going to deal with left to right. You're going to use your pretty much exactly the same equation, but instead of translating, you are rotating the object, and you're getting access to a different axis. You want to rotate using the horizontal axis. So pause for a second, give that a try, and come back when you've done that. Hopefully you took the time to pause and think about this problem, but if you didn't or you did and you just couldn't figure anything out, there's no worries. Like I said, it's the first project, so we're kind of reviewing all that stuff. But we want to basically do exactly the same thing we did in this code, but instead of translating, we'd like to rotate. So transform. We're doing something to the transform property again, and it automatically gives me a whole bunch of options. I know I want to rotate, and then I know I need to give it some vector 3 information. So looking back here in the inspector, I know I want it to move to the left and right, which is my x-axis. I want it to rotate, though, around its y-axis. It needs to go to the left and right. So you can experiment with which axis this is by dragging these ones back and forth to see which one you actually want to deal with. So we want to change the y position on there. So x will remain the same whenever I hit the side buttons. Y needs to be input dot get axis, and then I need the axis horizontal because those are the keys I'm looking for. You need to multiply that times time dot delta time, and then multiply that by our rotation speed, and then we'd want it to do nothing on the z-axis, and then we will end the statement with our semicolon and save it. Going back into Unity, I've changed my scene just a little bit so that I can see what it looks like out here and what it looks like over here. So I'm going to select the player so I can see in the inspector what's happening. And once it compiles, I should be able to hit the side keys and be able to turn to the side. Yep, right turns right and left turns left. So, perfect. Next, let's make a method so I can now navigate the maze, but I have no way to get to the next scene. So we're going to go ahead and set up a script for our goal so that we can move forward from here. To set up our goal, we need to do a couple of things. Let's look at our goal. So I'm going to select it here, and then I'm just going to hover over my scene view and hit F so that I find it. We need to make it so that we can trigger moving to the next scene. So let's add a component, and we know that for triggers, we can use collisions. And there are many different types of colliders. Now, last time we dealt with a lot of 2D colliders, but this time we're going to be dealing with a lot more colliders that are three-dimensional. For our end goal, I know I have a cylinder, but I actually think I'm going to go ahead and use a capsule here, a capsule collider, and then I'm going to edit it. Now, it is very much in the wrong spot. So let's see why this is so. Let's reset the transforms position and figure out why our collider is way over here. The Y set to there. Let's try this. Alright. Wacky fun. Don't know why that was way centered. Let's try recentering the cylinder too. Ah, I bet this will change something. Yep. If we reset the cylinder and reset the goal, now our capsule collider makes sense. So let me just go back before I added that collider and fix this. So our cylinder, whenever we made our grouping, broke how this is set. So if they're both set to 0, now if I move my goal to where I want it to be, it will play nice. Maybe bring it down into the ground a little bit more. There we go. Alright. Now let's give it a collider. Now it'll make a whole lot more sense. So, capsule collider. And then let's edit it. And then let's make the shape that we need it to be. So it's a little bit taller than the shape. I want it to be just a little bit wider. There we go. And we want to make sure it is a trigger. So all this looks good here. We've got it around our goal, and we've got it set as a trigger. Now we need a script. Create C# script and call it goal. And wait for it to compile here. and drop that onto our goal object. Opening goal here, we know we need to be able to control going between scenes, and we need a certain namespace, which I'm hoping you are guessing is using Unity Engine .scene management. Semicolon to close that off, because we're going to need to load our next scene from within there. So conveniently, we have this that we can reference right here, our scene loader script. To set up our movement between scenes, you might remember back whenever we used the goal in our bouncing physics game, we used a method called OnTriggerEnter 2D. So I'm going to go ahead and say private void OnTrigger, and now we can see this list of things right here. So before we were using OnTriggerEnter 2D, which says 2D physics only, which is not what we want. We want OnTriggerEnter regular. And within here, because we're using scene management, we know we can use the information from our scene loader. I'm going to go ahead and just type it all out just to review. So scene manager dot load scene, which it's already trying to fill in, and then in parentheses I'm going to go scene manager dot get active, and then that is a method dot build index, or maybe don't fill it in and just go to the next screen, build index. And then once we have dot build index, we're just going to add 1 to it, like so. And this should set it up. One last thing we need to do in Unity is we need to make sure that our player has a rigid body to it. So I'm going to just put it on my actual player module itself. It could be on either, that's fine. So I'm going to delete this rigid body and just add another one. I added it while I was testing it. So if you hit add component and type in rigid body, again, you should be familiar with Rigidbody 2D, but we're using the regular rigid body. And we're going to freeze the position of the rigid body so that whenever we're moving around, it doesn't fall over, which you might have experienced whenever you were testing it with movement. So let's freeze let's see, I believe the y-axis will stop it from doing it. So I'm right up next to my goal here, and whenever I hit play, I should be able to run through it and go to the next scene, which is perfect. That's exactly what I wanted to do. So now you should be able to hook up your scenes in succession. One last thing before you start building more levels is you should probably start making your stuff into prefabs, because otherwise it's difficult to make sure that everything is consistent across each level. So let's go ahead and do that. So things that we will definitely need, that we want to be the same across the whole thing. We'll take the game overlay, make that a prefab, the goal, the player for sure. I will save the walls. I might edit the materials, but as we've experienced in the past, it's nice to have the actual physical object. I don't really care about prefabbing the light. It's going to be maybe something that I'll want to play with later, but for now I'm good with the default direction and the amount of light that it has. So I've got all of those things now set up so that they are regular old normal prefabs that I can call on whenever I need them. So I want you to go ahead and make, let's say, 3 more mazes, and make them progressively more difficult so that the player has to navigate through and get to more spaces. You can change the coloring and the themes if you want, but otherwise you should be able to navigate the maze. Also, I would recommend playing around with how fast you want your turn speed to be and what it looks like to run around. So go ahead and make your game, not your whole game, but go ahead and make at least 3 more levels of progressing difficulty, and we will meet back after you've got that all figured out and carry on from there.